So I'm Jason Chase, one of the names on these slides. Ian Clown, he is not at BlinkOn, otherwise I would be making him do this talk because he's the expert in feature policy. So anything that goes well, you can thank him. Anything that goes poorly, you can blame me. So you may have seen, if you're at the recent BlinkOn, Ian did a talk called Feature Policies for a Better Web. And you might be wondering, wait a minute, why are we talking about document policies? So the story there is we did feature policy, and I'll get into the backstory. It shipped. That's the new hotness we've been talking about. But now we're talking about document policy. Why is that? So I just want to go back to the motivation behind feature policy. So we had these two ideas, the royal we, around signaling and control. So this kind of problem where developers really didn't have a way to say, here's the parts of the platform we actually use, and then control, this problem of, hey, I want to compose third-party content, or I want to, content I don't trust. And in a little bit more detail, before I build up head of steam, feel free to interrupt at any point for questions. I dropped a mic there. Happy to take them at any point. So from a signaling perspective, kind of think about this problem where this web is, this platform that's evolved over time. It was originally meant to serve, static text, linked, and now we've built applications and all kinds of stuff. So not surprisingly, it's accumulated some warts and stuff over the years. And the state of the world kind of pre-feature policy was that, well, that entire breadth of functionality was available to every page, even if there's things we wish we could take away or we wish we had done differently. And so without some kind of signal from what's used on a page or not, it's really hard to prune things from the platform without breaking content. And then I touched on this from a control perspective. Websites need to embed things, often ads or widgets, what have you. They need those for the functionality or monetization, but they don't necessarily trust that content. And then even for yourself, yourself as a web developer, there might be features like, we really don't want to use geolocation. There's no reason for our site to use geolocation, but that might be easy to sneak in unintentionally, whether it's a less experienced developer on your engineering team, whether it's, oh, we're gonna add this commenting widget and we didn't realize it uses geolocation. So, there's things you just say, no, our site doesn't need these at all. So, two kinds of control you might want to express. Okay, so that was a motivation. So, so we have this feature policy thing. So this is where we landed at one point. This is what we implemented in SHIP. And so, like it says, it's a mechanism to let developers, declare in an unambiguous fashion, here are the features we use, and here's which features I want subframes or child frames to use. And that today, it's an HTTP header, which allows you to specify policies for yourself as a document. And then there's an allow attribute on iframes. And then again, the kind of key features or behaviors we have in feature policy is that it's a one-way toggle where once you turn a feature off, it's off permanently and you can't re-enable it, either in your own page or down the tree of subframes. And again, this policy is inherited all the way down. So as a way to give you really defined and reliable control over content. So that's what we had today. Now, we've run into some challenges. Some of this by feedback from other browser vendors like Mozilla. We've been working a lot with once they were looking to implement feature policy, and they were really interested in feature policy for permissions use cases. But then, we started bumping into some challenges. And big one is the inheritance model I talked about. So the fact that you can declare a policy and say, for example, the example I'll use is document.write. We had this idea of, man, we really want to turn off document.write, for performance reasons. But you could imagine scenarios where some content you embed relies on document.write to inject a script for security purposes. And so now if you turn off document.write, that script doesn't get included, and now you've broken that page in a potentially meaningful, or that subframe in a potentially meaningful way. You know, do we have a concrete example of that? No, but you can imagine these kind of things. And more generally now, with an inheritance model like this, you're allowing one frame, or, you know, to have control over a cross-origin frame in a way that that frame is not opted into. And generally, for permissions, we think, well, that's fine because permissions have a well-established failure mode where, you know, you have to ask for permission, and you don't expect to get it. And so we thought, you know, that could apply to other types of features, but now, you know, it is a can of worms you potentially open up. So beyond the inheritance model, you know, like I said, there's the general idea of signaling and control, but as we went to use it for new use cases or unexpected use cases, then you kind of, again, bump into some restrictions, or where maybe this doesn't work perfectly. And so, you know, this leads into the next point about the syntax. So we've talked about this, using feature policy to enforce best practices. And, you know, so then we're like, okay, we don't want oversized images. Well, because feature policy is a one-way toggle and we can't break the web, you have to kind of do this double negation where you say, we don't want oversized images, but we have to allow them, and then you turn them off. So then you kind of end up with this naming. And then we said, well, actually, now we want to have not just Booleans, we want to have values like, well, what compression ratio or what sizing ratio? So then you see this admittedly ugly syntax where, oh, there's lots of quotes and parentheses and stars, and, you know, what the heck's going on here? And so then finally, you know, as we examine these use cases, you know, there's a lot of debate internally, like inside Chrome and with Mozilla and other folks, like, so what's the best mechanism, like from a developer ergonomics perspective? Is it best to have one mechanism where you configure all these different types of or different classes of features? Is it better to have multiple? So a lot of debate there, and, you know, it's not clear there was one obvious right answer, but so these are some of the challenges. So the solution we came up with was to introduce this new mechanism that we're calling document policy right now. Bike shedding to become, the naming is hard, but we kind of landed on document policy because the main idea here is that you're applying this policy just to yourself, right, to one document, and it doesn't have this automatic inheritance. So then the idea is feature policy does fit really well with this idea of delegation of trust, namely, you know, saying which features, powerful features, I want my subframes to be able to use, right? So, you know, it's largely permissions, but other things that maybe aren't represented by a permission would also fit in this idea of powerful features. And then we use document policy for other cases of feature configuration, including Sandbox, which I'll get to a little bit more. So there is an explainer. You can read more, and some of what I've just pulled some examples out of that here. So similar to feature policy, it's still around this concept of turning on and off features, but, you know, with more configuration. Similarly, there's still the idea of reporting. I didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but feature policy comes with the idea of reporting and a report-only mode. So you can set a policy and just figure out what would happen. You know, this is modeled off of CSP. So we'll have the same thing in document policy. The big differences are now, instead of just a Boolean on/off, you can configure values for policies, and we'll see some examples in a minute. And instead of, you know, configuring a list of which origins can use a feature, you're configuring values and you're applying this policy to yourself. And now you have kind of optional enforcement in child frames as opposed to forced inheritance. So again, feel free to jump in with questions. So yeah, Sandbox. So, you know, if you look and you say, well, Sandbox is about powerful features, maybe it should be feature policy. But the big difference here is, you know, with feature policy and powerful features, is kind of this concept of, well, these powerful features are typically available by default in the top level frame and disabled by default in cross-origin frames. And so then you're using feature policy to kind of allow them in those cross-origin frames. Whereas it's kind of the reverse with Sandbox, right? Like with Sandbox, what you're actually trying to do is restrict features that are already available. And so that fits, we think, better with document policy, with this idea of turning things off that are already available or configuring things that are already available. And the other thing is more of a technical reason, but it's around the behavior and pop-ups. So today with permissions, if you pop up, a window, then the idea is you're resetting, and all the permissions could be available there, because again, the idea is the user can see an origin in the arrow bar, so they have some concept of being able to understand who they're granting permissions to. Whereas with Sandbox, again, when you don't want to be able to pop up window to escape the sandbox, and so that's why it fits better with document policy, because the idea is that, again, the restrictions you place will flow through to the new window. Okay, so I want to make sure there's some time for questions. So I'll, run through some examples. Won't dwell a whole lot on them. So, here you can see, you specify various policies, and we're playing with this idea of no dash as a way to say, no, turn this off, as a shortcut, syntactic sugar. Again, if you look at that image compression one, so there's an example where in a previous example, you might have seen oversized or unoptimized images, and the weird parentheses syntax too. So now this is using structured headers. So now you can say, we can get rid of this negation, just say, no, we want our image compression and we want our bytes per pixel to be 2, right? And then also, if you look at the frame loading example, you have this opportunity for maybe it's an enum effectively of values. So coming back to that embedded content idea. So feature policy has the allow attribute. For document policy, we're tentatively going with the policy attribute. And so again, this is where you can now enforce for child frames, but there's this opt-in. So you might specify this policy, no on-size media, and again, an image compression ratio. And that will do, again, modeled off of CSP embedded, is when we issue the request for that frame, we'll also issue a required document policy header. And we'll say, here's the policy you need to agree to. And then in response, the content for that frame will have to say, here's the policy I'm willing to agree to. And so in this first example, you'll see, well, it has no unsize media, so check, we agree on that. It adds some additional policies in terms of no document.write. And it has an image compression policy that is stricter than the previous version. And again, this is where there'll be some kind of per policy definition of what stricter means. But so here we see it's stricter in some ways, it matches in one ways, and it adds on additional policies, so that will be loaded. These other examples aren't at least as strict, so they would cause a network error. So we talk about sandboxing. So we're still playing with the examples here, but so here you see some things you might be familiar with Sandbox. And again, the challenge with Sandbox today is effectively we can't extend it without breaking content, because it's a turn everything off, and then it's got a bajillion flags, so you selectively turn things back on. But it means we can't add a new flag without potentially breaking all the content. So by having Sandbox as part of document policy, now we've flipped it. And so now you selectively turn off things, and now we can add new things because it's opt-in to each thing. And so, for example, you can say, okay, so this first example, or we just want to disable scripts, right? And then the other thing, obviously, that Sandbox, as soon as you slap the Sandbox attribute, you get an opaque origin. So now, we can imagine a policy that would do the same thing. So what still needs work is, okay, what happens with combinations of these things, right? Like, okay, so if I say Sandbox and I say policy scripts, what does that mean exactly? Should we allow this? Do we need to prevent you from doing the wrong thing? And you can, so the first example is just turning on one thing, maybe that's okay. The second one is like, okay, now we have a clear conflict. So what do we do? So we still need to work out those kind of things. So real quick, what stays in feature policy, there's lots of mainly permissions, i.e. powerful features that have shipped today with, feature policies. So we think those will stay there. They fit really well, as I said, with the model of feature policy. And then these are all things we've been experimenting with in various ways, shapes, form. We think these will move to document policy. That's the whole reason. And subject to renaming and such, right? Because now that we don't have the double negation problem. And so, like I said, there's some outstanding questions. So we have shipped a policy for SyncXHR under feature policy. Has seen some use. So we kind of need to figure out, does that stay under feature policy? Does it move to document policy? Is it a powerful feature? Probably not. But it's kind of a unique beast, we think. So then some of the other potentially thorny things are, there's use cases where maybe what we want is to draw an iframe, is to draw a boundary around an iframe and everything within it, but not have whatever policy be enforced all the way down. So you can imagine, for example, we've talked to folks like maybe in the ad space where what I really want is for this iframe, I know it's going to contain an ad, so I want to make sure that this iframe can't script anything outside. But within that, do what you want, right? You can imagine there might be nested subframes in there that do want a scripting relationship. But even with what we've proposed right now for document policy, you still kind of have this enforcement happening all the way down. So, early thinking right now is, well, maybe what you have is just per policy, you define this policy doesn't inherit, right? If you really want to apply, if you want it to be enforced all the way down, you have to reapply it yourself. So that's something we're still working through. And then the other thing, so with Sandbox, I didn't really mention this explicitly. The idea with Sandbox, as we add policies to document policy that mirror the existing Sandbox attribute, is that those don't require the opt-in because we've already effectively safe listed. We said it's okay to restrict these things. But you can imagine as we add new features, like, well, is it okay to restrict this without acknowledgement? So that's another outstanding question. And I'm sure there's more we'll uncover as we write the spec and so on. So speaking of, so the target, we're working on this now actively. The goal is to have document policy behind a flag or ready for origin trial, an MAD, which is a couple weeks. So Ian and others are madly working away back while I'm enjoying the conference here. So then with this kind of split, we know there's spec updates to feature policy. We're not sure what they all are yet. Mozilla, for example, would love to see feature policy move to structured header syntax as well. It's not currently. We'd have to think about how we could migrate it since we have shipped it and there are people using it. And then similarly, have the document policy spec ready end of this year. And then any changes we do need to make to the implementation, we'd be targeting kind of M81 the next. Right, so that's kind of quick tour between feature policy versus document policy. Again, if you're looking as a feature author, you're like, wow, that one of those can help me. I want to integrate. Like, we're happy to consult. Can contact us that way. Like I said, Ian's the expert. He's leading this work and would be giving this talk if he were here. But we're happy to answer questions. Happy to help with integration. So that's about it. And good, we have time for questions, if there are any.
Yeah, I have two questions. First question is, do we have a plan for where client hints permission is supposed to go between document policy and feature policy? Where this is kind of a weird one where it's like a powerful feature, but we don't want to expose it as a permission to the user because it's kind of like in the guts of the engine. Yes, that is a good question. I know Ian was talking with folks at TPAC about what's the plan for that. So he warned me about some potential dragons, but I forget what we said about that one. So I'd have to tell you to follow up with Ian. Yeah, context there is just some of the privacy sandbox things might have similar properties to the client hints. Problem. So yes, we should chat about that. Yes. The one other quick question is, you mentioned that the iframes have to agree via HTTP response header to the document policy. What about if you wanted to apply a document policy to like about source doc or about blank document that you're sort of injecting content into?
Yeah. Yeah, that has come up in the context of like, ads use cases as well, right? Because often the solution is they're injecting frames via script, and we don't want to have to round trip to the server and stuff. So we're still kind of working through what that might look like, and that's again with this idea of I just want to apply a policy at this boundary and let the things within. So that is another question we haven't solved exactly. Okay. Yes. Cool. But thanks for bringing that up.
Thanks.
Hi. So I know in Sandbox we have things that control pop-ups. Is it coming to document policy as well?
So the idea is that we will have an equivalent in document policy for all of the attributes we have in Sandbox. So we'd actually done a bunch of implementation for that under feature policy.
Okay.
So yes, the general intent is that there will be document policy equivalents for everything.
Okay, cool. Context there is my team is implementing cross-origin opener policy, which has some specification about the sandboxing of pop-ups.
Right.
Yeah. A second question is, I know we're also working on origin policy. Are document policy and origin policy just going to live alongside each other or in interactions?
So the idea would be that you could specify your document policy and feature policy in origin policy, again, because you can imagine certain policies as things you want to apply origin-wide and not customize per document. Yeah. So one would eat the other. I don't know whether the right description is. Any other? Here.
Hey, so I don't have that much context about this, but is there like going to be in like many years down the line some sort of way to kind of encourage websites that don't really know about this to follow it, if you get what I mean? Like kind of maybe turning someone on by default or doing something a bit less breaking?
Yeah, let me just get the camera. Yes. So going back to what I talked about, feature policy is the new hotness. So for example, we were up on stage at this ugly mug was up on stage at CDS last year talking about, hey, here's amazing things you could do with feature policy. So we're still very excited about the concept of using now document policies for best practices. And so, for example, we're looking at, well, how could you, how are the ways you can get this in developers' hands, right? You could imagine, I don't know if you're at Nicole's talking both yesterday and at CDS about how they were working with frameworks as a way to activate features. So you can imagine where, hey, let's get this as default settings in framework of choice, right? You could imagine, we're kind of prototyping, hey, what if we had Lighthouse integration where, an optimized images is a good example. Lighthouse already has audits around that. And we say, wow, you're doing great, or you're not doing so great with your images. If you could turn on this policy to help with that problem, right? Like we think, now we haven't proven it, we think that could be a powerful way, like especially if you think of as a way to enforce best practices within your dev team, you have your TL or whatever says, okay, here's what we should really be doing. Here's a way to encodify those standards for less experienced developers so they don't make those mistakes. So that is something we have been pursuing and will continue to pursue in terms of getting this in developers' hands. The one thing I didn't mention was we saw feature policy as the tool, but the combination of the tool as a way to address this sprawling web platform problem. Like you can imagine if we can get people to opt into saying, I only use this subset, or you could imagine a group of features like modern web, what version number here, right? Like if you can use that to get people to drive down usage of things we want to deprecate, like syntax HR, if you have people explicitly opting out, then you have a better sense of how much it's actually used, or whether it's safe to turn off features. Not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you very much.
A couple questions. One is for the performance guardrails features, what is the failure mode? I know that's gone through some iterations. The first one was like it just inverted the colors.
Yes, that's another good question, right? So I think that's going to be tied to it's going to be feature dependent. So yeah, the implementation we have today of a flag behind some of the image ones is it used to invert the colors. What it currently does now is it replaces it with a placeholder, like you might see if you were in Data Saver. It replaces it with that same placeholder that says the size. So it's really A, feature dependent, and B, what we need. We're trying to find partners to give us feedback about what's the right behavior there, right? That's part of the reason we really have report only as well. So we imagine a flow where you might turn it on in some kind of enforcement or braking mode in dev or even staging environments, and then production you do report only.
Right, and especially with like user-generated content and things, you still execute the image load. You're not actually saving the bytes. It's really just a signal when it turns gray.
Yeah,
but
we, again, if people are willing to tolerate breakage, we had did some experiments with can you stop loading to actually save those bytes. It was just a quick experiment that didn't work out well because of how we were doing it, but those are still things we want to explore, right?
Cool. And then the other question is, you were talking about the origin policy integration before, and I'm pretty sure that being able to set these things in a meta HTTP equiv is dead. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There is the adoption question where if you were able to set them in meta tags, like you could imagine that would make it easier to adopt for some folks that don't control maybe their HTTP headers as whatever. But I think it was Mike West that was discussed at TPAC. It's kind of come up on an issue, and I think Mike West said he regrets doing that for CSP. And it is this problem because today the assumption is your policy gets stamped more or less when you create the document. So now it can change what, right?
Right. So
yeah. So I think the current answer would be maybe a combination of origin policy or maybe the hosting, whatever ecosystem will move and make it more easy to configure these things.
One can hope.
Yes, one can hope. Yeah. I think in the various conversations I've been a part of, I've heard, it's just, there's no great solution to overcome some of kind of the technical bits with doing HTTP equiv or whatever. No other. Okay. Then maybe we finished right on time. All right. Thanks, folks. Again, if you want to talk more, come find me and I will try and answer them and or point you towards Ian. Thank you.